Our final panel on a terrific day, and I really want to thank everyone for coming and powering through three of these terrific discussions. We are really delighted to have three of the best here, and I've gotten to work with all three of them over the last set of years, and this is really a terrific group of people. Starting with our moderator and the executive vice president here at the Brookings Institution, my colleague for many years, who is also twice ambassador to Israel and also worked as the special coordinator for Middle East peace and as the White House person. So he has seen this from all different sides of the equation. And he was going to be a panelist, but the moderator, Bruce Jones, who's the vice president for foreign policy at Brookings, came down sick. So we're going to ask Martin to do double duty because I think he has his own observations and input on what these transitions are like and what they look like. And then also two colleagues from the Miller Center, one of whom I was fortunate enough to have as a colleague in government, and another of whom we have all been fortunate enough to have as a public service, Philip Zelikow, who is a Miller professor at White Burkett Miller professor at the Miller Center, and in the history department at the University of Virginia, is a past director at the Miller Center and the executive director of the 9/11 Commission, which was a report on one of the great first-year crises in American history. And Eric Edelman, who was very important in my first year in government. Eric has the distinction, and I'll tell this joke, even though a few people in the room have heard it, of having been chief of staff for Strobe Talbot and also chief of staff and then later national security advisor for Vice President Cheney. Dick Holbrooke once said to Eric, "Wow, you must either be the greatest foreign service officer in the history of the department or a total political whore." To which Eric responded, "The two are not mutually exclusive."
It's a true story.
Also Undersecretary of Policy at the Defense Department, and the Schlesinger Chair at the Miller Center, which is a chair endowed in the name of James Schlesinger, a former professor of economics at the University of Virginia, Defense Secretary, Energy Secretary, including a number of other different posts as well. And Eric will also, when that one-year visiting fellowship ends, visiting professorship ends, will be a senior fellow at the Miller Center starting in January. So with all of that, I'm going to hand it over to Martin to lead us in this discussion.
Thank you very much, Bill. I had the honor and challenge of serving President Bill Clinton in the White House in his first year in office when I was handling the Middle East. As Bill has explained, we have rich experience between the three of us when it comes to first years of presidents, both Republican and Democrat, when it comes to foreign and national security policy. I was just reviewing the record from the Miller Center timelines and was reminded that in Clinton's first year in office, in February, he had to deal with a World Trade Center bombing that few people will remember, but that was the initial one, six people killed and 1,000 injured. In June, Clinton ordered the first use of force in his presidency against Saddam Hussein, a retaliation for the attempt to assassinate George H.W. Bush on a visit to Kuwait during the first year of Clinton's presidency. In July, we had the gays in the military issue, the famous don't ask, don't tell policy, which caused a huge ruckus and political blowback. And then in September, we had Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin shaking hands on the White House lawn, the September 13th signing of the Oslo Accords. October, some of you will remember Black Hawk Down and the whole reaction to the situation in Mogadishu and Somalia, which led to Clinton's withdrawal of all troops from Somalia, which had a real big impact on his credibility when it came to deployment of force. And then in December, we had NAFTA. So it's just a reminder. I know Phil can talk about 9/11 and the impact that had on the Bush agenda, and we'll come to Eric in a moment. But it's inevitable that events, as Harold Macmillan, Prime Minister of Britain, would often remind people, it's events, my boy, that seem to drive foreign policy in the first year. And so it's likely to be in the first year of President Trump's administration as well. So what's the advice to presidents in their first year that you to draw from your experience about what they should try to put in place in their first year to deal with the kind of phenomenon of drinking from the fire hydrant when it comes to foreign policy?
So the default tendency of government is to drift and remain on autopilot, often accompanied by noise, and then things happen and you react to them, and your tenure then ends up getting defined by your reactions. That's the natural default tendency. The hardest thing to do in government is actually to corral people together and accomplish something purposeful. That requires great skill. Drift is actually not very hard. As I say, in most agencies, actually at most times, in some ways that's the default mode. People just keep doing what it is they've been doing, and then stuff happens. You will always be busy, and the inbox will always be full, and there will always be meetings and events and many things to discuss, and there will always be surface noise and turbulence. The dog barks and the caravan will move on. Now, my advice actually, and this gets a little more into process weeds, for if there are people here who actually wanted to, some concrete advice as to how to make a difference. I'd only, for this sophisticated Washington group, and there are some veterans here of many things, I'd only single out three things. One, if you want to do anything big, you've got to do it with the Congress. Do it with the Congress. There's a very great tendency in these sorts of meetings about foreign policy to be very executive branch centric. But in fact, I've served in many executive branch jobs and have only worked with Congress when I had to, but it's had to happen several times. So let me just illustrate what I mean with a couple of concrete examples, one from the past and one right now that could be informative to this administration. One from the past. All of you know that President-elect Obama did as one of his first acts, I'm going to close Guantanamo. One of the first acts. Now, he did not, in preparing this, they put everything in motion, the executive order, the speech. They did not deeply consult with Congress before they made their move. Had they consulted with Congress before they made their move, were there people in Congress who quietly would have said, yes, we'll help you? Yes, there were such people. There were such Republicans. Senator John McCain, for example. You see, the challenge here was, if you're going to close Guantanamo, replace it with what? Then if you have a plan for, well, let's replace it with this, and then we have kind of a plan developed as basically which state is going to get it. Then you might have a chance of getting political support among the representatives of all the other states. And get it out of the way. So by announcing we're going to close Guantanamo, and then you hadn't done the homework with Congress about where and how. So what happened? Well, every member of Congress gives out a NIMBY statement. The politics of this then become poisonous and movement is impossible. And here we are 8 years later and Guantanamo is not closed. So it's just, I believe this was a possibility. Might not have been, but it could have been done. But because you You were thinking executive branch centric, didn't work. Now let me give an example from right now. A lot of discussion in the news about tariffs or about different things to restrict trade, which is a big-time foreign policy question, maybe the most important foreign policy question in the foreground for immediate action by this administration. How many of you in the audience, raise your hands if you know what I mean when I say the words destination basis taxation? All right, there are about 6 or 7 of you. This is hugely important with respect to trade right now. Right now, the House majority, led by Paul Ryan, Kevin McCarthy, and Kevin Brady, are developing corporate tax reform that basically all the broken stuff having to do with income shifting and profit shifting and all that, which is a long broken problem, very serious. Hoarding of gigantic cash piles overseas, all of that. They're trying to develop an approach to that that has to do with territoriality and something called destination basis that would involve, that basically would turn our corporate tax system into an income system that's a facsimile of a consumption-based system, like the VAT systems that almost all of our trading partners use, and actually would create a more equal playing field in many ways for companies. Because of the border adjustments that will happen in implementing this system, not altogether dissimilar to the border adjustments you make if you buy a product with VAT and then take it out. This will have the effect, if their plan goes through, of having a huge impact on import-intensive products. There will be no taxes at all on things that are being sold for export. It has enormous implications for terms of trade, as the people who are watching this understand. There will be lots of adjustments to it and arguments over WTO compliance and so on. I happen to think that it's a creative idea of great interest. My point is this, is if you in the executive branch, if the people who are right now on the landing teams at USTR, like Dan D'Amico and others, and the people who are interested in doing something to show economic nationalism, and who are thinking about whether or not to withdraw from NAFTA and break all kinds of crockery, will hold their fire. You can't work that agenda and also do what Paul Ryan's trying to do at the same time. And if Paul Ryan has a chance of getting through his package, it's going to have such a substantial impact that you're going to want to wait and see what that impact is before you decide whether or not you want to do a lot of other stuff. It could result in the repatriation of hundreds of billions of dollars in domestic business investment and a lot of other positive things that Kevin McCarthy and Kevin Brady will gladly describe to you. So, congressional partnership. I spent a little time on those 2 examples. I'm not going to spend as much time on the other 2 suggestions because I want to hear from Eric, and so does Martin, and so do you. Second one is staff. Put a premium on policy staff work, written policy staff work. In my professional experience now going back more than 30 years, I've seen an enormous decline in the quality of written staff work in the government, regardless of administration. What happens then is people make their staffs larger and they hold more meetings because people don't know actually how to do written analysis. Written concrete operational analysis where they detail choreographies, describe pros and cons, and how to do things. And then isolate the key issues in writing for decision to concentrate time and focus. This seems like a trivial procedural detail. Quality staff work is a matter of life and death. That is not hyperbole. That is a true statement that I have seen happen in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It is a matter of life and death, and it is scarcely even taught to people who are going into even mid-level offices. Third and final point. There's a lot of good discussions which we'll get into about the NSC staff and its relation to the executive departments and so on. So I just want to tag something that doesn't get very much attention, which is the need to link policy planning and policy analysis to budget development. to budget development. If you actually studied the NSC staff and then didn't notice where does OMB fit into the NSC staff system, answer is, well, not much really. But everyone in here who has private sector experience knows as a first principle that of course you manage with budgets, well, except in national security, except at the top of the government. And that has very large consequences. And we're about to enter a period in which there's going to be fantastic budget strain and budget arguments, which I hope will fruitfully be resolved, but will be of the first importance. So I think that's a maxim that's worth remembering.
Thank you, Phil. Eric, what's your
My advice.
advice?
Well, first of all, thank you, Martin. It's great to be here with you and Philip, and thanks to Bill for bringing me to the Miller Center this year to be part of this terrific project, which I think has done fabulous work. So let me start out with a confession. Yesterday, when I should have been preparing to speak here today, I was watching the Redskins instead. And the Redskins sort of managed to beat the hapless Philadelphia Eagles. And as I was having kind of pangs of bad conscience about not preparing, I was watching the game and I thought, tomorrow I ought to talk about blocking and tackling. You know, the really simple things that need to get done in government that we kind of don't do. So I would say two things, one on personnel and one on policy, and they really are the same thing. First is on the personnel side. One of the biggest challenges that a president has in national security is getting their arms around the apparatus of the government that conducts national security affairs. It's not a new observation. Henry Kissinger made this observation back in 1966 before he became secretary in a justly famous essay about domestic structure and foreign policy. And about 7 years ago, I think I was here on this Brookings stage doing a book event for the late Peter Rodman's book, Presidential Command, which makes the same observation. This is the first and most enormous challenge that a president has. And so the focus on personnel is really important. But as one of the earlier panels noted, the tendency tends to be on the high-profile cabinet positions. And not enough attention, I think, gets focused on putting together teams of people who, both within the agencies, can work together and across the agencies can work together. Because if you can't get that kind of teamwork, you will inevitably have all sorts of dysfunctions, particularly in the first year when a lot of people aren't confirmed. It now, on average, takes about 9 months, and I believe it'll be longer in this transition, to get everybody in place. Philip and I both were part of the Romney transition team planning in 2012. We began our work in July, and by the eve of the election, we were prepared to go in, and Philip was on the intelligence side, I was on the defense side. We were prepared to go in, and we had slates of candidates for all the Senate-confirmed positions that could be presented to the cabinet designees, and we had focused, at least on the defense transition, very much on the question of how can we get people who can work together so you don't get the kinds of dysfunction you sometimes have when, right now with Secretary Carter and the Navy Secretary Ray Mabus, but we've had in other defense departments with the sub-cabinet appointees and the difficulties they can present. Second part of that personnel issue is to understand that the career elements in the Department of Defense, Department of State, and the Central Intelligence Agency, other agencies, are not the enemy. They are the subject matter experts who can help you succeed, but only if you establish a relationship of trust with them and also provide them leadership. They have to know, they have to have commander's intent, as we used to say in the Department of Defense. They have to know what direction the new team is trying to move in. And I'll just say that on that score, they have to overcome, the new team, whoever it is, has to overcome a deep bias. My Foreign Service colleague, former Foreign Service colleague Avis Bolin, used to have what she called her iron law of transitions, which was no matter how much you hated the last group of political appointees who were your overlords in the outgoing administration, the new team actually makes you have nostalgia for the old one. And which I think is a testimony to the sort of rough shakedown cruise that almost every first year of an administration turns out to be. The second piece of advice I would give is to try and, in the early period, spend some time in the first few weeks before something happens, before events, as Macmillan said, start to drive you, to actually understand the policy in being before you start trying to change it. There are inevitably caricatures of what the policy actually is. The folks who are in government have been working this in extraordinary detail. There is a lot that can go wrong when you start to make adjustments. And it's not that you shouldn't change the policies. It's every administration comes in and wants to do that appropriately. But you need to understand what it is you're changing before you start changing it. And all too often, people come in with a lot of bright ideas that haven't, as Philip says, and I agree completely with what he says about staff work, they haven't been adequately staffed. And the first order of business for orderly staff work is to understand what it is that is in place before you start to change it.
Thank you. One of the things I like to focus on is the relationship between the White House and the different departments and agencies of national security. We clearly have a situation now where there's a good deal of tension between the incoming president and the CIA, and the standard tension between the CIA and the FBI. But when you think back to Kissinger's days, also with Brzezinski and Vance, Kissinger and Rogers, the NSC and the State Department were really at loggerheads for much of those early years in the Nixon administration, and then in the Carter administration. We had the same in Bush 43 between Rumsfeld, Colin Powell, and Vice President Cheney. You were involved with. So, what's your sense, given your experience with all of that, about how to ensure that it doesn't end up dysfunctional, or is it just in the nature of the personalities rather than the structure of things that you're going to have these kinds of tensions? Is there anything that you can advise about what needs to be done in that regard to avoid the kinds of battle royals that we've seen in the past?
Yes, there is. First, let me talk about the NSC staff issues for just a second, and then I want to touch on the FBI-CIA issues. The NSC staff issues, is the NSC staff too large? Yes. Is it micromanaged too much? Yes, I think so. I think it's because basically it's extremely large and they're holding constant meetings because they don't know better. But it's not a Democratic-Republican phenomenon.
We talk about 400 staffers now?
I say this, I was on the NSC staff for George H.W. Bush and Brent Scowcroft.
What was it in those days?
50 professionals.
Yeah.
And it's generally regarded as having been a highly functional staff operation.
But it was too small.
Actually, it was not too small. No, we only...
I thought it was too small.
We were only able to end the Cold War and win the Gulf War. And by the way, when Franklin Roosevelt won World War II with the largest national security establishment the country has ever seen, and running 50% of the United States economy to boot, they did that with 9 White House staffers. And this was not because Roosevelt was disengaged or Harry Hopkins. So this tells you something that about the what you're doing is important. And there's an Eisenhower system that was totally different and but also highly functional. The point about that is, though, it's rather than get into, well, it's too, shrink it by a third. I was on a transition where we got that on an NSC transition. Just shrink it by a third. That's a meaningless thing to say. It's like, what do you want the staff to do? And what do you want the executive departments to do? and then work on the staff numbers that flow from that if you actually are clear about how these jobs are defined. Most NSC staff jobs, you might be interested to learn, don't even come with a written job description, much less any training. I mean, not one day of training. So this is, if you work on the substance of what these people do, what the different roles are, a lot of this stuff will then begin to take care of itself. If you actually begin to realize that the more you bloat the staff, in some ways you make staffers more powerful. You don't actually make the president any wiser or more powerful. It's a difference. Now, so NSC staff. Let me talk a little bit about the FBI CIA issues, because this is, I'm uneasy about this. When I did the 9/11 Commission work, one of the administrations we looked at was the Clinton administration, which, as you may remember, Martin, had a dysfunctional relationship with the director of the FBI, Louis Freeh, who have suspected that his White House clients might be engaged in criminal activity that he would have to investigate. No matter who was going to be elected in November, a difficult relationship with the FBI director was and is assured, but that's one of the reasons Congress tried to give the FBI director a high degree of independence in the way they've set up the job. We'll see how that works out. If you keep the current director, it's strained. If you fire the current director, could be worse, actually. So there's a problem. You have then all this stuff with all this flack with the intelligence community. So here's the kind of the point I wanted to make about this, is all this flack is undermining a condition of trust. Now, I want to stress, the value of trust is not so that the presidents will salute when the intelligence community talks. That's not the point. You get the trust not so that they will always agree. You get the trust so you can have healthy arguments. Usually, a condition of distrust results in frozen relationships where each side begins behaving in passive-aggressive ways, kind of throwing their assessments across the transom to the others, ignoring, and so on. And what you don't get is the healthy give and take and interaction, which can be tough-minded and has to be. I mean, the greatest intelligence disaster of my lifetime was the WMD catastrophe with Iraq in 2002. The problem in that catastrophe was not that they interacted too little. It's they should have interacted much, much more. They should have been a much more tough-minded argument going on about the nature of the intelligence, and actually that should have been going on even back in the Clinton years when those assessments originated, actually. So you're building trust, frankly, so that you can have those kinds of discussions with different intelligence agencies quarreling over different things, and FBI has this take or CIA has that take, but nobody in the conversation feels like they're threatened by that. And if you, as the atmosphere gets frostier and frostier, it's not a matter of who agrees with whom, it's a matter of the quality of the thought and the quality of the discussion.
I largely agree with Philip. I mean, first of all, it is natural that your cabinet officers and the other members of the National Security Council, when they meet in the various fora, whether deputies or principals, are going to represent the view of their agency, which has a specific mission, and therefore will look at things differently. In the Department of Defense, we look at things differently than we did in the Department of State. And from the White House, you have yet a different view. And having, at various points in my career, been in all three of those positions, it's natural. And you want some disagreement. I mean, you don't want unanimity. I mean, when I said you need teamwork, that's different than saying unanimity. I mean, the last thing you want is groupthink, premature closure on issues where people think they have the answer before they've actually talked it all through, as Philip was just suggesting. And that is a very hard thing to orchestrate, particularly when you have very big personalities and previous reputations, et cetera. And in particular, I think one of the challenges is that the cabinet secretaries and the director of CIA or the director of national intelligence have a kind of Janus-faced role. You know, on the one hand, they are the instrument of the president imposing his agenda on the respective institution. On the other, they are the voice of the institutional interests and prerogatives of the institution they sit on top of, and trying to make that point of view heard in the interagency deliberations. And maintaining the balance of those two roles is very hard for individual, cabinet officers, I think. And frankly, a emotionally intelligent president will be looking for people who can balance those two roles when they pick their cabinet officers.
So do you expect, either of you expect to see the kind of bureaucratic warfare that we've seen between previous national security advisors and either Secretaries of State or Secretaries of Defense? Or does this look, of course, we don't know exactly who the Secretary of State is going to end up at this point, but we have a former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency as National Security Advisor, and he has some pretty strong views about the intelligence agency. So, it looks like it's baked into the system already. Is that?
Well, as one of the panelists earlier said, or a couple of panelists earlier said, who knows? I don't, I think it's going to be a little hard to tell. I will say this, anybody who thinks that it doesn't matter whether someone was a 3-star or a 4-star has never worked a day in the Pentagon.
So unpack that one for us.
And I think that I'm going to be very interested to see how the dynamic, between, or among, I should say,
Flynn having been a 3-star, Mattis having been a 4-star.
And Kelly. And so
Kelly a 4-star.
The dynamic among Generals Kelly and Mattis, who are fantastic people, and General Flynn, who was a first-rate intelligence professional in his career, it's going to be very interesting to see how that dynamic plays out.
Does it matter that we have we're going to likely have a general in charge of the civilian side of the Pentagon?
I do think it matters. I think the law was drafted, pretty carefully back in 1947. The circumstances have changed from the circumstances we faced then when we were initially unifying the military departments and creating the Unified Department of Defense. And so maybe the urgency is a little bit less than it was, but there still is, I think, there are a number of issues that come along with this. I know General Mattis. He's a really outstanding, thoughtful, extremely well-read officer, and I'm sure he's very well aware of the pitfalls and the dangers, and I'm sure he'll be trying very hard to avoid stepping in those. But there are issues, I think, having to do with democratic, political, civilian control of the military that arise from this.
Phil, let's go back to Congress and a different dimension of this.
I was conjuring up this mental image of high school chemistry class gone wild, where you let the students use any compounds they want and start mixing them up, and who knows what will happen. You kind of stand outside in the hall, you hear all this stuff fizzing and smoking in the classroom, and fumes begin to leak out and through the door. Ooh, I wonder what's going on. I wonder what will happen.
Right. It feels like...
I wonder what will happen.
It feels like that. Well, apropos of that, since we're all wondering, everybody here I'm sure is wondering, we haven't had a president that sees disruptive diplomacy as a constructive and productive way of moving forward. What kind of challenge is that going to pose to the national security agencies, where we've got the first instance of that was with the phone call from President of Taiwan. Kellyanne Conway today said that President Trump's going to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem.
The Chinese embassy to Jerusalem. From Beijing to Jerusalem.
The Taiwanese
kind of centralize these operations in Asia.
So, you have any experience with this about how the national security bureaucracies are going to deal with this kind of disruptive approach to?
Well, actually, this is kind of what they thought was going to happen in December 1980 after Reagan was elected. They thought the apocalypse might be coming. Didn't quite turn out that way. But you just have to kind of recover some of the images people had back then. But this is different. Donald Trump is sui generis. This is a different situation. He's, on the one hand, no one who went through this campaign thinks, a natural-born diplomat is he. But on the other hand, this is a man who's written a book called The Art of the Deal. So actually, in this spirit, I have like an 8,000-word essay coming out tomorrow called The Art of the Global Deal, in which I basically say, gee, if I really took this seriously, and took their theme seriously, here's how one might go about connecting the dots. Because here's the interesting thing that I think they'll encounter. There are some things there are some things they're going to want to get done. The domestic agenda alone, I can see where that's going, and there are serious people involved in it, and that's going to take up 150% of the oxygen in the room. Just the domestic agenda plus immigration.
So we're talking tax reform, infrastructure bill.
Oh, and there's this little thing about health care. So, man, and they are serious, and that's moving. So that's 150% of the oxygen in the room. Now, what's left over for foreign policy? And then you ask yourself, like, how much noise do I want foreign policy to make in the first 6 to 9 months? Actually, when President Bush came into office in 2001, he wasn't looking to make a lot of headlines on foreign policy. He had some heavy lifting he wanted to do on the domestic side, and so does this administration. So does Mike Pence and Paul Ryan. So there's that factor. Then there's another factor, is I can find people in this team who will want to pick fights with about 3/4 of the countries in the world. I think I can pretty seriously just about get there without working hard. And it turns out that if you do that, you're going to make a lot of noise and consume a lot of oxygen. I actually think that the last few years have been very bad for the United States and for the global system. So my big takeaway from that is, ladies and gentlemen, we now need to enter a time of preparedness. We need to make our country stronger. If you think of this as if it were 1975 after the Vietnam War, or if you like even darker analogies, 1935, we would counsel preparedness. Preparedness doesn't mean you go around picking fights with everyone you can find while you're getting prepared. If you speak softly and carry a big stick, first start getting the big stick ready. So ideally that would mean you would actually avoid all unnecessary fights while you were getting stronger, while you were making your institutions stronger. And you would try to attract all the friends you possibly could if you really were worried about our situation in the world. You see, that begins to drive you, even if you're worried about the condition in the world, which the president-elect says he is, that could drive you actually into thinking about diplomacy. If you want to attract friends, avoid unnecessary fights while concentrating on preparedness. Diplomacy will be your handmaiden.
Interesting. Eric, we're going to go to the audience for questions, but since you worked for Vice President Cheney as his national security advisor, and it seems clear that Vice President Pence is going to take on a lot of the load when it comes to national security foreign policy. What do you think about that? How's that going to work itself out?
I think there's one big difference between the relationship that President George W. Bush and Dick Cheney had, and Andy Card is in the crowd, so he can correct me if I'm wrong, but and the relationship that President-elect Trump and Vice President-elect Pence have, and that is that Vice President Cheney had no higher political ambitions, and the relationship he therefore had with the president was, I think, unfreighted by that natural tension that occurs between other presidents and vice presidents. And Vice President Pence, I think, clearly is someone who potentially has a political future in elective politics, and that will introduce, I think, potentially some tensions. I also think that, I have very high regard for Vice President-elect Pence. I thought of all the statements made by any of the candidates in the 3 debates on foreign affairs, he was the most articulate, the most compelling when discussing Syria and Russia. But in the second presidential debate, it didn't take too long before the president-elect disowned him and threw him under the bus in terms of those positions. So I think there's potentially some danger here in that. I would say, Martin, to your earlier point on disruption, if I could, this I know is sort of heresy for the foreign affairs clerisy, but I personally was not troubled that much by the phone call from President Tsai. I think it's fine.
Taiwanese president.
The Taiwanese president. I don't think, I think it's fine to perhaps throw folks in Beijing off balance a little bit. That doesn't bother me. What does bother me is that one would have hoped that it was the result of a deliberative process and part of a clearly thought out strategy with a plan for how you manage all of this. And it's pretty clear from the president-elect's comments over the weekend that that was not the case. I also think that the reaction from Beijing, which was actually, I thought, pretty mild, should not have elicited a tweet storm. And I think part of the issue here is that it's fine for the president to try and change our policies. He was elected. He has the right to do that. And it's fine to decide you don't want to be bound by the one China policy anymore. But to just say we're not going to be bound by things that we've undertaken as a nation before through multiple administrations has, I think, ripple effects he may not yet be aware of in terms of the way it will call into question, both for our allies and potential adversaries, America's commitments in other parts of the world. And I think that is a very, the credibility of our commitments, I think, have already been undermined to some degree by an incumbent president who has not paid enough attention to that and who has been pretty dismissive of the harping on credibility. But I think it's actually very, very important.
Might be interesting just to give you an illustration of what we mean about diplomacy and strategy. So Eric just talked about the phone call with President Tsai of Taiwan, and actually we both share the view that in itself that's not necessarily shocking. And then there was the follow-on tweet storm. Here's the point. We are getting ready to adopt an economic approach that probably is going to confront China economically in some fashion. There are some arguments about how. So we are already planning to push them fairly hard economically. So the question is, as a strategic matter, you say to yourself, if we're actually going to have we might have an economic confrontation with China in the coming year. You also say to yourself, hey, let's escalate this too and make it a confrontation with them on their other core interests, having to do with their definition of sovereignty and other things in the region, and let's confront them on all those core interests at the same time. Is that the smart play?
The president-elect addressed that yesterday as something that he would trade off. But I think President Tsai of Taiwan would have a little bit of a problem being a card,
being a pawn, yeah,
right, used in the trade-off.
No, if Henry, look, this you could imagine, like, gee, if Henry Kissinger on steroids was available and says, I'm going to create confrontations.
He was actually in Beijing.
He's not taking steroids anymore. If you confront them on all these fronts simultaneously, and then good, now you're worried about everything, we're going to construct this incredibly elaborate deal in which basically we're going to roll back our relations to where it was in the mid-1970s and then try to recraft the whole bargain from scratch on all these issues. That would test the skills of the wisest and most experienced statesmen we had. So maybe if we thought we could pull that bit of legerdemain off, that's one story. While we're, again, doing all this domestic stuff and everything else.
While the
you
Chinese
see,
also hold over $1 trillion of our treasury bills.
anyway, but you see the problem, and maybe in a way the rebuttal to basically the kind of strategic approach that Eric and I are counseling, which isn't so much ducking a fight with China, it's more how to pick and structure it. And the Chinese leaders know that a difficult phase is coming, but they'd like to try to channel that constructively and manage the internal threats in their world.
So what you want is disruption with a purpose, rather than just disruption for its own sake. Let's go to the audience. Let's take 3 questions first, and we'll come back to the panelists. Yes, please.
Hi.
Identify yourself.
My name is Jack Kropensky, unaffiliated. Simple question about how many different major initiatives can the new president handle, and his team, and how would you split that between domestic, where you have like the legislative clock for the first year, versus international, where there's a lot of things that aren't under your control, but there's a lot of important things like China and Russia and the Middle East.
Over here.
Peter Bloom, retired Foreign Service officer. You say, Philip, you talked extensively about, before we get too much more involved, foreign policy, about preparedness. And I'd like to know what your definition is. And what we're hearing is, a big military build-up budget, which will, of course, if things go, would hurt a domestic budget. Of course, that'll become a fight. But I'd like your definition of what preparedness really means in the context of what you were talking about.
Is there a third question? Slide you out. Okay. Eric, you want to start with priorities and preparedness?
Well, I think if the president-elect is going to make good on his Philadelphia speech, in which he talked about rebuilding the military, then I hope he would take advantage of the window of opportunity that people in previous panels have talked about in terms of united government, to seek a repeal of the Budget Control Act and an end to sequestration of the defense budget and a move back to a top line, I would argue, as we did in the bipartisan National Defense Panel that reported out 2 years ago at the request of the Congress, that it be at the level that Bob Gates set it at for the FY12 budget proposed by the Obama administration before BCA and sequestration hit, which would, in effect, going out in the next 10 years, essentially restore a lot of the money that was cut out of the defense budget during the last 8 years. Because I think that is going to be a sine qua non for having an effective diplomatic effort. I'm fond of quoting George Kennan to my Foreign Service colleagues, who gave a lecture in 1946 at the National War College in which he said, you have no idea how much more civil and polite diplomatic exchanges are if you have a little bit of military power sitting, behind you. And I think that's an important facilitator for the president. And I would add that I think there ought to be a supplemental, an emergency supplemental, as Chairman Thornberry of the House Armed Services Committee and Senator Tom Cotton in the Senate have called for, to deal with some of the readiness problems that have been identified by the Obama administration and the chiefs right now.
So on the question about a number of priorities, it's a shrewd question. Andy Card, who is here, looked after this question in 2001. If my memory is right, Andy, there were 2 big ones, taxes and education, both on the domestic side. This administration, I think, currently is planning to do at least 4, possibly 5 huge lifts. What are the 4? Immigration, tax reform, healthcare,
Infrastructure.
Supreme Court. That's 4. You want to throw in infrastructure, then whether or not you count overall budget balancing, lifting sequestration, and budget targets as yet another. Anyway, we could go on, but you're already beginning to sense the scale. So, and you do have an unusual constellation of circumstances and people in which much may be possible, but then the question will be how much, and again, then that has implications for how you want to manage your confirmation fights, your foreign policy stuff, because if you're thinking strategically. Now, the question about preparedness, Eric's point is exactly right, which I'd only add two things. One is, think about, I believe both the foreign policy and defense policy institutions are actually fundamentally still stuck in the late 20th century and are highly optimized to win the Cold War and remain so 25 years later with various clip-ons that have been snapped onto them over the last 25 years. I think both foreign and defense institutions actually are in need in profound overhaul and rethinking of the kind that occurred in many respects in the 20s and 30s, but also the memory of what we did in the 70s and 80s after Vietnam is very interesting, especially on the defense side. But we need that kind of gravity of thinking now. Just take the example of cybersecurity alone, and which is very much in the news today, in terms of kind of the level of our capabilities as we're contemplating, even if we made negative conclusions, if you started asking yourself, well, what would we do about it if we came to very negative conclusions about foreign intervention in our country's politics? What would we do about that? What options could a president even consider under the current circumstances and so on? You begin to see the concerns about preparedness, but it's not just a defense matter. And above all, if you make it just spend more money, if you spend more money into basically dysfunctional and broken institutions, you're going to get like 20% thermal efficiency for your spending. I think you're going to make a much better case with the Congress for much more spending if you couple that with dramatic and vivid interest in a different story of how the money will be invested. After 9/11, Don Rumsfeld effectively was given, between FY01 and FY06, $1 trillion of additional defense investment, not counting the OCO budgets. More than $1 trillion. What did we do with? Did we get $1 trillion worth of bang and adaptation for that buck? And I contend we did not. We shouldn't do that again.
So Donald Trump tweeted about the 747s for the president and said that Boeing was essentially overcharging. Today he tweeted
After Lockheed today, yeah.
that F-35s are too expensive. So what do you think, first of all, about the idea that we need a new story here, and should we expect that Donald Trump is going to take on the defense industrial complex?
Well, I agree with Philip that I would not invest $1 trillion going forward in the program of record as it exists now. And the truth is the Department of Defense has been living on the benefits of the Carter-Reagan defense buildup for a very, very long time, and we have not been investing in maintaining our qualitative edge over potential adversaries for a very long time, which is why both Secretaries Hagel and Secretary Carter have been very focused on the potential of our losing that edge and the importance of what they call the third offset strategy, which is an effort to find ways to leap ahead in new technologies. And that's, I think, a very important effort. It'll be interesting to see what the new administration does with that effort as they come into office. I am troubled by the way the president-elect has been attacking Boeing and Lockheed, and neither one of them are paying me to say this, but the president of the United States has just enormous power, and I'm not sure the president-elect appreciates how much what he's doing is going to affect the stock price of these companies, is going to shape the way they respond to different kinds of Defense Department requirements and contracts, et cetera. I mean, there's a whole chain, a concatenation of things that will flow from this that I'm not sure he's thinking all the way through, and I think it's troublesome. F-35 has had its problems as a program, but I don't think tweeting is the way to deal with it.
We'll leave it at that. Thank you all very much.